Welcome to everybody here today. It's our pleasure to introduce Christine Leah, Dr. Christine Leah, I should say. She is a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University at their Grand Strategy program. She previously was a Stanton Fellow at that venerable institution, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She spent time at the RAND Corporation, at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and with a variety of other organizations that I won't run down here. They're in her bio, but they're all equally impressive. We're happy to welcome her here today. She's got one book on the presses that we would commend to all of you, Australia and the Bomb, terrific book on Australia's history of nuclear weapons program, and a new one that will be out in the next year or two, and we're looking forward to reading that too, tentatively titled The Legacy of Nuclear Weapons on Strategy. So without further ado, Dr. Christine Leah. Welcome.
Howdy. First of all, thank you all very much. I'm very grateful and deeply honored to be here, and I'm absolutely delighted to be seeing some familiar faces and hopefully making new friends. I guess I was originally invited out here to talk about my first book, which is Australia and the Bomb, but I wanted to talk about something more interesting. But the book, this one here, is basically about Australia's nuclear weapons program, the history of it, what it means for today, and how Australia thought about US extended nuclear deterrence. As I show in the book, US extended nuclear deterrence actually had no effect in Australia's decision to ratify the NPT. And so it talks about current dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region, China's rise, US conventional military power, and what it means for possible shifts in Australia's thinking about its nuclear identity. But today I want to talk about something much more interesting, which is I'm going to argue that both, one, further nuclear reductions beyond current start levels, and second, the more absolute idea of nuclear disarmament are misguided ideas. Even with successful elimination of nuclear weapons, the tasks of strategy, deterrence, extended deterrence, and arms control, they don't go away. Instead, they become even more difficult to manage, especially if non-nuclear hypersonic ballistic and cruise missiles take the center stage. And there's a major historical reason for this. We often forget that the development of nuclear warheads coincided roughly with the development of short, medium, intermediate, and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles. The atomic bomb followed so quickly on the heels of the German V-1 and V-2 bombs that it never became apparent that missiles had, in fact, transformed the nature of warfare. In other words, the atomic bomb stole the show. So this has implications for our thinking about the role of missiles with conventional warheads in deterrence and extended deterrence relationships, as well as arms control policies. So let me put this another way. Since 1945, our conceptions of strategic stability, alliances, deterrence, and arms control have all been forged on a nuclear anvil. The near coincidence of the invention of missiles and nuclear warheads has led deterrence literature to overlook the strategic impact of missiles in their own respect. So I'm calling this a hypothetical second conventional age. An age where our thinking about the use of conventional missiles is not overshadowed by the prospect of nuclear explosions. So, okay, this all sounds a little bit abstract right now, but as I'll show later on, this relates directly to issues of US strategy, or lack thereof, in the Asia-Pacific today, which currently de-emphasizes the role of strategic and especially tactical nuclear weapons in extending deterrence to South Korea, Japan, and even Australia. So as I'm going to argue, further nuclear reductions by the US and relying more on conventional forces for deterrence is actually going to make the task of extended deterrence much harder. First, okay, very quick background about conventional forces and deterrence. Not unsurprisingly, because of nuclear weapons, there is comparatively little literature on conventional deterrence. But what does exist provides a useful baseline for evaluating its desirability. The most important work was by John Mearsheimer, who argued that if one side had the capacity to launch a blitzkrieg, then conventional deterrence would likely fail. In other words, you need to prevent the enemy from winning a quick and decisive victory by credibly threatening a protracted war of attrition. So Mearsheimer's analysis may have been persuasive for the pre-nuclear era, but the pre-nuclear era did not also involve missiles. And his analysis was based on a European land context, not the Asian maritime context. So the literature on conventional deterrence is incomplete. And current debates in Washington about substituting conventional forces for nuclear ones ignore this gap in history. And as I mentioned before, after the V1 and the V2s, the atomic warhead stole the missile's chance at making an impact on strategic concepts on its own. It was because of their immense destructive capabilities, nuclear weapons, the absolute weapon, that ended up marking a turning point in world politics. Missiles were reduced to being an enabler of that destructive capacity. They would provide the speed at which that destructive capacity could be brought. Now, this has implications for how states like the United States thought about shaping world order. For most of its history, the US has been a relatively isolationist power. It's easy to take for granted just how impressive a feat it was for Washington to establish alliances with countries in Asia, half the world away. US nuclear capabilities and their long-range delivery systems were integral to that enterprise. Without the bomb, Washington might not have had the appetite or the audacity to undertake such vast and significant security commitments. So nuclear weapons connect allies, especially places, as far away as Australia, in ways that weren't possible before without forward deploying substantial conventional forces to the Allies' territory, which, by the way, costs a lot of money. In the conventional age, commitments need to be much more explicit and physically visible to appear credible. And that becomes more difficult and costly for the protector state, depending on how far away its ally is. Relatively less effort is needed when nuclear weapons are involved. So while it's not going to happen anytime soon, the idea of lowering the stockpiles of the United States and Russia to, say, a couple of thousand deployed each brings the big issues of conventional strategy back to the surface. Okay, first problem of conventional military power. When your adversaries are great powers with regional interests and exist thousands of miles away, conventional military force, or its ability for coercion and deterrence, is actually quite weak. Especially if you're going to use conventional ICBMs, which can't carry as much explosive capacity as nuclear warheads. I don't need to tell you guys the effects of nuclear weapons and their destructive capacities compared to conventional payloads. And so the only near-nuclear heavy explosive bombs are huge, heavy things like the massive ordnance air blast bomb, which is far too heavy to put on a Minuteman, for example. As such, if you're going to use conventional missiles in deterrence, a truly strategic threat of widespread destruction would require a capacity to launch tens of thousands of missiles, depending on what both sides perceive to be a strategic threat. And besides, you can easily argue that arsenals numbering above, say, 8,000 non-nuclear missiles are even more destabilizing and would probably generate arms races, with knock-on effects for other countries, specifically in Asia, who don't rely on US extended deterrence and who have traditionally not been so preoccupied with nuclear issues. I'm thinking of Southeast Asian countries here. But these countries are preoccupied with conventional force imbalances. Okay, so that's just some conceptual background. I now want to use the Asia Pacific as a sort of test case to illustrate what other issues might arise that we'd have to deal with. One of the factors that puts Asia in stark contrast to Western Europe is the sheer logistical difficulties of conventional deterrence in a maritime environment. And it's only now, it seems to me, only now that US planners are actually starting to think very seriously about the logistics and operational issues of extended deterrence, not just the nuclear, but the conventional, especially. because it was never given much attention before, because US sea power in the region was never contested. Europe was, and remains, one single geostrategic entity connected by land. In the Asia-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan are more dispersed and far apart from each other, with neutral and non-aligned states dotted here and there in between. The US forces need to be able to move around a lot of vessels, aircraft, troops, and munitions around this environment. A significant problem here is that the US and allied air and naval bases in the Western Pacific are vulnerable to Chinese conventional ballistic and cruise missile strikes, for example. The closer the base is to Chinese territory, the more vulnerable it is. Guam is also within range of cruise missile strikes launched from Chinese aircraft and submarines. Just a couple of examples. But overall, there are significant logistical challenges that arise out of this geography. For example, the need to ensure prompt replenishment of destroyed combat ships, establishing defensive perimeters for fleet support, ensuring the safety of fleet replenishment oilers and dry cargo or ammunition supply ships. There's the difficulty of concentrating large numbers of strike aircraft in places other than on aircraft carriers, which, by the way, are also limited in number, which substantially reduces sortie rates. A recent RAND study showed that the deployment of high numbers of strike aircraft close to the enemy during interventions against Iraq's attack on Kuwait, for example, allowed US and coalition forces to generate high sortie rates and put a significant amount of ordnance on targets, which made important contributions to military victory. However, Iraq was a relatively weak adversary and largely lacked the capability to strike US bases and major weapons systems like aircraft carriers and other forces the United States had deployed around the area. But that's not the case with China, which wields a formidable arsenal of cruise and ballistic missiles. And so placing more forces in theater and closer to allies makes them more vulnerable to enemy surprise attack, while aircraft carriers will not be as vulnerable. Putting them farther back in a crisis reduces sortie rates, thereby reducing the potency of the deterrent that the United States might be able to bring to bear. Penetrating long-range bombers may offer an advantage here, but they alone may not be sufficient to perform all the warfighting and deterrence tasks. So a lack of forward bases also creates significantly longer ship and submarine transit times to and from more distant resupply points. Submarines and many surface combatant ships are currently unable to replenish their missile magazines without sailing back to the US West Coast. Other issues: how quickly cruisers and destroyers exhaust their missiles, how adversaries will attempt to use cheap missiles like the BrahMos to attack US warships, and then get the US in turn to use more expensive defenses first, like the long-range SM-6. There's also the rate at which missiles can be launched, the amount and availability of sensor resources that can be devoted to BMD versus other missions. There's the capacity of combat logistics forces to cycle ammunition ships between rear bases and forward reloading areas, maintaining long-range, high-capacity, carrier-based aerial refueling capabilities, and, of course, again, ordnance consumption rates. In 2013, the Obama administration, it was considering reducing the number of carrier strike groups from 11 to perhaps 8 or 9. And I see a new bill has been proposed recently by Senator Markey. I'm not quite sure how important he is in US politics, to reduce the number of nuclear-armed submarines from the current 14 Ohio class to a deployed force of just 8. And these issues, they become more important if different reports, especially the CSBA, according to the CSBA in 2013, the estimated build rate of the Chinese ballistic missile inventory, they may have, if you believe the report, they may well have thousands of ballistic missiles by the 2020s. There are competing analyses and recommendations by different think tanks, but it's true overall Chinese forces pale in comparison to US forces in the region, but it is clear that Beijing has been trying to address this imbalance, including with land attack cruise missiles and nuclear-powered submarines with SLBMs. And so US bases are increasingly under threat also from precision strike systems, which calls into question the logic of relying on conventional systems to deter aggression at different rungs of the escalation ladder. This is where, ironically, maybe ironically, tactical nuclear weapons may be needed to deter aggression at lower levels of conflict, and even maybe serve as an instrument of de-escalation. So numbers are just one part of the story. What is important is that which US and Chinese ships, aircraft, and missiles will be available at the outset of hostilities, how they will be used, how well they'll perform, the resolve of both parties to achieve various military objectives. What actions does the US want to deter? Will US carriers even be able to get close enough to China's shores to launch offensive airstrikes? Will US naval vessels be outgunned by Chinese ships? Will China conduct conventional missile strikes against US regional air bases? For how long? To what extent does China hold home court advantage in terms of resolve? These are some of the issues. But it is clear, reading all the reports coming out of Washington, it's clear that China's been gradually building up sea denial capabilities, which have progressively increased the costs for the US to maintain sea control. Now, whilst the United States has commitments all over the world, Beijing only has to focus all of its military power in one area. And sea denial is a lot easier than sea control. But if Washington decides that more forces are needed in theater, then attempting to deter Chinese actions by conventional means may in fact prove even more conducive to a destabilizing regional arms race than an extended deterrence posture that includes the threat of using nuclear weapons, especially the use of smaller yield tactical nuclear weapons. And I know Bridge Colby has already touched upon this topic. So as I've tried to just show, further reducing the nuclear stockpile is going to make extended deterrence a lot harder to achieve, not least because many more forces will be required in the conventional realm. And that in turn will require significant additional logistical support. So on the bigger issue of why further nuclear reductions is not necessarily a smart idea. If the US and Russia reduce their arsenals to, say, a couple of thousand deployed warheads, and other nations go down to a few score, might we see a conventional arms race try to fill the gap left by nuclear weapons? The US Conventional Prompt Global Strike program has provoked significant unease in Moscow. That's just an example. And whilst the New START Treaty sets limits on conventional ICBMs and SLBMs, it doesn't contain any constraints on current or planned conventional prompt global strike. So this bigger issue demonstrates that the more may be worse, more may be better debate between Scott Sagan and Kenneth Waltz is entirely relevant to the conventional realm. Waltz famously argued that because that more nuclear weapons in the world would tend to increase deterrence and therefore stability between states. But that logic turns on its head in a second conventional age. More conventional systems generating tension, arms races, and conflict absent the threat of nuclear escalation may actually make the world a less safe place. Not least because states might be less risk averse with conventional forces, and the concepts of first and second strike capabilities are much less well defined in the conventional world. Ultimately, they would have to acquire many more long and short-range missiles to be seen as having an advantage. So given all these factors, stability would be much more fragile. And on the bigger issue of nuclear disarmament, removing nuclear weapons does not take away proliferation problems from the agenda. A world not anxious about nuclear proliferation is more likely to be anxious about the proliferation of advanced conventional systems. Might we fear arms races in the second conventional age less because of the sub-nuclear consequences of the acquisition of advanced precision strike systems? Or should we fear it more because of the lower threshold to the use of armed force that might be involved? In that world, the knowledge that a war might escalate to the use of an immediate and devastating nuclear strike is gone. And this also raises this raises new issues influencing the extent to which a conventional war may actually be more controllable than a nuclear one. And there's another important issue, which is that the historical record clearly shows that there isn't the same taboo or a norm against using conventional missiles as there is with nuclear weapons. Not a single nuclear warhead has been delivered by any power since 1945. By contrast, in a 30-year period, well, it's over 30 years now, ballistic missiles, conventional ones, were used in at least 6 different conflicts. The Egyptian and Syrian missile attacks on Israel in the 73 war, the 1980-88 war between Iraq and Iran, the Afghan Civil War, the Persian Gulf War, the Yemen Civil War, and of course the 2003 US-led attack on Iraq. And so, the duration, again, the duration and controllability of war also becomes an important issue here, because there aren't the same dynamics of escalation control and escalation dominance. So all these issues raise the importance of focusing on conventional arms control as much as nuclear reductions. The NPT and the US offer both negative and positive security assurances to non-nuclear weapons states in exchange for staying non-nuclear. By contrast, the MTCR and the great powers do not offer rewards for states that abstain from going ballistic. Kenneth Waltz famously argued that it might not matter so much who gets the bomb, because nuclear weapons tend to be stabilizing, regardless of whether those states are responsible actors or not, because of the deterrent effect, again. But that logic does not necessarily apply with conventional weapons, especially if that state possesses conventional ballistic missiles. So if we look to the future, given their increasing precision and proliferation, would the first focus in conventional arms control be ballistic and cruise missiles? Some have advocated eliminating ballistic missiles completely, and even a ban on all missiles. But if we were to consider eliminating conventional missiles, logically we might consider controlling the proliferation of certain types of aircraft as well, since these also allow states an important degree of strategic reach. To some extent, they're seen as less destabilizing or dangerous, but as RAND studies and other studies have shown, given their military effectiveness, given the military effectiveness of precision strike aircraft compared to missiles, it might also be useful to consider these in conventional arms control regimes. I'm not saying that's a reasonable proposition, but rather just to point out that people who argue for further nuclear reductions and even disarmament have to understand how nuclear weapons play into the broader military balance between states. Show me a credible, if you're going to argue for nuclear reductions, I want to be convinced that there will also be a conventional arms control regime in place. But if history gives us any lessons, which it usually does, conventional arms control isn't going to work in the longer term. In the book that Jonathan Pearl so graciously mentioned, thank you, by the way, in the book I'm working on at the moment, I have a chapter on lessons learned from arms control in the pre-nuclear era. So what concepts, metrics, and bargaining were used in various debates from the late 1800s to the late 1930s. And the reason I look at the pre-nuclear is that it might help us to think about conventional arms control in negotiating further nuclear reductions. But what I've found is that agreeing on limitations is wrought with difficulties linked to geography, defense spending, cross-cutting geopolitical interests, shifting alliances, rearmament capabilities, and of course the constant evolution of military technology. So very, very, very quickly, a quick overview. A few of the issues that came up, in example, the Hague Peace Conferences. What should be the areas of focus? Should more attention be given to land, naval, air power, or overall defense spending? What's the yardstick of power? What does each country think is enough for national security? Can you make a distinction between capabilities for sea denial and sea control? What's the concept of security? This is a point the French were arguing in the 1920s. While the British were focusing on limiting naval capabilities, the French argued that disarmament measures need to be fashioned around the concept of security. In other words, it's not enough to limit just naval capabilities. They were arguing that you need to understand the interdependence of land, naval, and aerial capabilities, and to factor how these interact into the war potential of each country. And so, as I argue, the same applies to nuclear weapons. They're one part of a broader military equation. So I'll conclude with a few thoughts about the future. First, during the Cold War, the credibility of extended deterrence depended on Washington being able to show that it was capable and willing to fight a nuclear war, hence the deployment of short intermediate range nuclear missiles and concepts such as escalation control, damage limitation, etc. But the same issues hold true for conventional extended deterrence, except the challenges for US forces in the Asia-Pacific are immense. Second, we know today, you read the news every day, and we know there's a lot more interest in the operational aspects of extended deterrence by Asian allies. And they should be more interested. The significant challenges I've outlined today indicate that it makes even more sense compared to Western European allies for Japan, South Korea, and Australia to have a better idea of US doctrine, targeting possibilities, and also escalation scenarios, especially if they're going to be contributing forces to military contingencies. Third, what are the alternatives? If the US can't demonstrate its ability to fight a conventional with China, then US allies will have to do a whole lot more for their own defense and stop free riding. Nuclear weapons helped prevent the Cold War from turning hot. In Asia, they can stop a conventional arms race that is forcing the United States to invest in weapons that can block the Chinese military on its doorstep, thousands of miles from its own. And here, I would not dismiss friendly proliferation, just like it happened in the 1960s. Just as a very quick example, when Australia was making significant efforts to acquire the bomb, the United States Washington did not put a lot of pressure on Canberra to stop its nuclear weapons program. There was even an idea floated by several people in the US Department of Defense to actually deploy US ICBMs on Australian soil. But overall, Australia was not considered to be a threat to non-proliferation. It was seen as something logical, a logical next step after Chinese proliferation, and an Australian nuclear weapons capability could actually contribute to regional stability. So in summary, I would argue that nuclear weapons tend to have a sobering effect in international politics. To those who argue for further nuclear reductions and or disarmament by the US and other powers, one does not simply extract the bomb from international security issues and hope for the best. Issues of conventional military power will re-emerge with new prominence and increase in danger, especially in the Asia Pacific, where the Asian tigers haven't yet figured out how to share a mountain. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Christine, for that very interesting talk, very provocative talk, and I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. I might take the moderator's privilege and ask the first question of you. So, Christine, you argue that conventional weapons have limited utility for stability and for extended deterrence. Are there also limits to the utility of nuclear weapons? What are they? For instance, will nuclear weapons help protect forward deployed forces? Will they help a country project power? I'm trying to draw you out a little bit on where that balance is. You say it's part of a broader strategic picture, where that balance lies between the conventional realm and the nuclear realm in affecting a state's national security goals.
Okay. Certainly there are limitations to what nuclear weapons can achieve, depending on what system we're talking about. Broadly, I would argue yes, there does need to be a balance, certainly, but what I'm arguing is that nuclear weapons will have a role. I think it's going to become more and more obvious that nuclear weapons will have a role in moderating tensions between the United States and China. We're not supposed to talk about conflict with China, I know, but I would argue that they're going to be increasingly relevant when it becomes more obvious what the scenarios might be, what acts of aggression China might take against different countries in Southeast Asia. Depending on how the United States views the dynamics of escalation, but I'm not the only one who has argued this. Bridge Colby was here a while ago talking about the third offset strategy, and I would agree with him that these weapons have a role to play in managing tensions and reminding the Chinese, okay, be careful, these weapons are here, we might use them.
This may be a fairly pedestrian question, but we're here 20 miles east of Silicon Valley, and we are Lawrence Livermore, so we're always conscious of where high technology can bring weapons exchanges. Now, some years ago, I'm rusty on this, some years ago, people were talking about the possible game-changing, sorry to use the word, of salvos of sea-skimming missiles, basically erasing the threat of United States carrier groups because they'd have to be offset so far out. We all have good imaginations. You can imagine a salvo of 1,000 sea-skimming missiles hitting a battle group, and it would not be pretty. If we can offset, if we can get if they can get the battle group outside of sortie range, we're in bad shape. So I worry, being not in this loop, of technology and information breakthroughs, which will change the strategic picture for countries that depend on naval projection of force.
Yes, yes. Oh, but what is the question? Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The question is, how should the United States bring sea-skimming missiles possibilities into its strategic planning when the United States is so dependent on carrier groups for projection of force? Sorry, that's the question.
Cool. I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure I have a good answer for that, because I'm only just starting to sort of get into the nitty-gritty of these issues. Well, from where would they be deployed? Also, is the question. How much are they going to cost? How many of them? Where we deploy them? How do allies feel about this? I also. Actually, one question I have for you guys also is, what about the role of laser weapons? Because
Good point.
Yeah. I'm not sure, like, to what extent, what role can laser weapons have in sort of these, in strengthening U.S. power in the region? I'm not entirely sure about the actual technology, but that seems to be like that. There's something here. Yeah, maybe it doesn't cost as much as launching a missile. I'm not sure, but I would love to know more about the. Watch this space.
Yes,
Yeah.
I will stay tuned.
Cool.
In the historical discussions of conventional arms control, what were the models for verification that they talked about, and would any of those survive today?
Verification was a huge issue. The British didn't like that idea at all, the idea of transparency, because one of the issues was if we're going to allow inspectors onto our territory, they're also going to have access to all our, because of the dual use nature of technology for aircraft, right? It's civilian, it's military, but it also has a whole host of other applications. So the British were quite concerned about this back in about 1915 and so forth, and in the 1920s. Verification of conventional weaponry is a lot harder, I would imagine, just because there's so much, and it feeds into so many other industries, and potentially sensitive ones, and that goes into the whole issue of industrial espionage. So also, yes, for that reason as well, I would argue against relying on a conventional arms control regime, just because of the huge issues in inspection and transparency and so forth.
I'm not quite sure what you said about whether conventional ballistic missiles on two sides are stabilizing or destabilizing, but I'm wondering what you think of the following situation. As you know, the INF Treaty has banned intermediate range ballistic missiles between the United States and Russia, but China's not party to it and has proliferated conventionally armed medium and soon intermediate range ballistic missiles quite widely.
Yeah.
So the issue is, what is your thought about what would happen if the United States pulled out of the treaty, or maybe the treaty goes through a demise because of Russian activities, and we deployed conventionally armed ballistic missiles in the Asia-Pacific region with a range to strike Chinese territory? Would that be an attractive deterrent? Would that be conventionally armed ballistic missiles? Would that be attractive as a deterrent to Chinese use of ballistic missiles, anti-ship and land attack? Or would that be destabilizing? Can you imagine that being an attractive or unattractive future?
I would personally like to see China much more involved and publicly talking about nuclear and conventional arms control regimes. And I would like to see a trilateral, well, the INF be extended to China. That would be preferable.
But not probable.
No, certainly not. Unfortunately. Rising powers don't tend to enter into arms control agreements. Well, I'm not sure if it would be destabilizing. I would tend to say no, because I mean, the US already has capabilities to strike the Chinese homeland with conventional systems. Okay, not as much as China has to hit US forces and US allies in the region, but I wouldn't, to me, it's kind of moot. The threat's already there, and maybe you're not just putting more conventional CBMs in the ICBMs in the region it's not going to add a lot. It would add a lot in terms of like the escalation ladder, giving you more options at the sub-nuclear level. But in terms of being more threatening to China, maybe not. But I'm not entirely sure about that. It's a great question. Thank you.
Christine, thanks for a very good presentation. You mentioned that rising powers don't tend to enter into arms control agreements. Do you look at this historically and find that to be true? What rising powers have been engaged in arms control discussions and haven't entered in, or are they largely not part of the arms control They're not invited to the table.
Yeah, yeah. The big exception to that is Japan in the Washington Naval Limitations Treaty. But Japan had other motivations for entering into that. Yes, I look at it from a historical perspective, and you can see this as in the 1920s. If you're talking about the British Empire, historically it seems that, well, with the example of the British Empire, designing sort of the League of Nations and other institutions, it was a way of the British Empire to sort of create an international order that would reflect and lock in Britain's place in the world. Because Britain realized that it was becoming more obvious that, oh, we're going to have to contend with a rising Germany, a rising Italy. Let's deal with this. Let's try to deal with this in a sort of international legal framework rather than trying to balance per se, and sort of keep the rising powers at a certain level rather than have to compete with them militarily. Based on what I've heard talking with officials and some other analysts, the Chinese are not interested in nuclear arms control. They're not even interested in having a nuclear dialogue, let alone conventional arms control, which is unfortunate. Yeah. Right.
Try to go to other direction. So you can see the all powers at some homogeneous piece, yeah? But you know, external politics is continuation of internal and vice versa. So as information flows inside the world, it's going easier. It's easier for people to realize that, government are not always acting in their benefits. Inside each society you have some elite which is interested to keep status quo and can use external politics to help this. And China is not homogeneous. Chinese people are likely not interested to be involved with the United States or Russia. Russian people are not interested to be involved with China or United States. Same is true about American people, I hope. Yeah? Now, how much control people can have over politics, and it depends on how much information they have. And information flow becomes easier and easier. Of course, you can try to use these capabilities to provide disinformation, but people trying to go around it and have informational exchange, and actually technology helping this. So what do you think? What is this factor's role in the global situation? People versus governments, and understanding by people the whole situation and their real interests, and not what government is telling them.
What was the question? Sorry.
Well, how do you think, what is the role of these processes, of better understanding by people the whole situation in the world, because they have more information coming?
Oh, I see.
And their reaction in politics and how they affect politics of their government.
So is the question about because populations have more information about what's going on in the world, they might be less interested in going to war, for example?
Correct.
Okay,
They
okay.
understand that war is not their interest. They would like to live better, not to have more warheads. You know?
Yeah. Okay. I don't have a good answer for that, but just well, it depends on the country you're living in. The governments can still exercise significant control over information flows, and
it becomes more difficult with
Yes.
progress in information technology.
yes,
Now, like cellular phones now can talk to each other without towers.
Yep,
So
yep.
you can propagate information, and government cannot stop it.
But you can also use propaganda. and stir up nationalist sentiment. That's not hard to do.
Propaganda, but you know, people have brains.
Yes, no, but no, I agree with you. I'm just commenting on based on what I see about Putin's rhetoric in China, rhetoric in North Korea, just as some examples. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, well, there are still ways of manipulating your population's attitude towards other countries.
If I could just make a follow-up comment on that. One example of that thing that Sergey was alluding to is, it's been called, I think, societal verification, in the idea that populations might be able to better understand the military postures of their own country or perhaps other countries, and that could sort of figure into the arms control debate. So that might be an example of how societies impact their governments by doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a comment, not a question.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. And you see that in the US with all these I think, well, you saw it in Australia in the 1980s, all these anti-nuclear groups. That was, mostly in reaction to the French testing in the Pacific, which was on French territory. That's not. Bruno Tertre is a brilliant analyst in Paris. He pointed that out, and it made me laugh because it's sadly true.
Just as a follow-up for the previous two comments, I'm really winging it here, but this brings into question the idea of deterrence. When we've thought of deterrence as government deterrence, or military deterrence. Now, at least with some countries, not others, for better or worse, I would have to say as an American, for better, there's more of a public knowledge and public dialogue. So does this cause us to shift our concepts of deterrence? Do deterrence and democracy work? Have we thought that through?
Oh, that's a great question. I would comment. My impression is that there is almost no public debate on deterrence in the United States. It's dominated, the dialogue or the discussions are dominated by the arms control and disarmament community. There isn't, but
It can change.
yeah, no, totally, yeah, absolutely. And I would strongly encourage more public debate about deterrence and the role of the U.S. military in the world. And in other democracies like France, you just turn on the news and there's almost never any debate about France's military policy, let alone.
That's France.
Well, yeah.
Okay, come on.
France has no troops over Pacific.
No, but we have nuclear weapons operating in that region, sir. No, I agree that that's a great question, but I'd point out that ties into the bigger question of public debate on military issues, which there's not enough of. So.
I'm just saying it changes the deterrence conversation.
Yeah, totally. Yep, great point. Yeah.
Let me ask a possibly ill-posed question. There's always a great discussion about asymmetries and offsets in deterrence or defense or belligerence. Does the conventional realm make this better or worse? And I'm thinking of the issues you brought up of investment in large versus small systems, the ability to perhaps defeat large systems with small systems, and then you bring up conventional deterrence and arms negotiations in the 20s and 30s, where it seemed to me two relatively small rising powers took on the world and very nearly succeeded, whether it was Japan versus the United States and Britain, or Germany versus the rest of Europe and Russia. Is there something to be learned there about conventional asymmetry and offset?
Absolutely. An example, this was an example in the 1920s. I think it was at one of the Hague Peace Conferences. There was a debate between Great Britain and France on limiting buildup of submarines. The British were strongly arguing, no, you and Italy, you guys, you're only allowed X amount of submarines with X tonnage. The French were like, well, you guys have more battleships than us. We need subs to offset your battleships and torpedoes and so forth. So the issue of asymmetry is not a new one. It's historically, it's fascinating going back into the literature. You go into these old annals of American law journals and all the debates. It's fascinating. Does the asymmetry become better or worse, or more important?
Or more complex.
Or more complex, yeah. Because like normally it's, you acquire, well, a state like Pakistan can acquire nuclear weapons because it sees an asymmetry with India. But you still have the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons. But with asymmetries in the conventional realm, it can lead, again, to a destabilizing arms race that could easily break out into a conflict because someone doesn't like somebody else and one soldier went too far and then stepped over this tank or various scenarios. But yeah, I would say that conventional asymmetries become a lot more dangerous.
Did the timescales become shorter and therefore more destabilizing? One tends to think of nuclear timescales as being decadal in that regard.
Yeah, because with nuclear weapons, like the damage is immediate and huge.
But also the time to develop a nuclear program
yes.
is large, whereas perhaps a drone offset
Yes.
would be
Yes.
something you could do very quickly.
Yep. Yes, I would agree with you. And this was actually also an issue. Historically, this has been an issue. Like, how much lead time did different countries have? And I've got a chart in one of my chapters on the industrial capacity of different European states. And the other Europeans were really worried about Germany because they were building up at a rate that was really concerning. So the concept, we talk about nuclear latency and nuclear lead times, but that's not a new concept, actually. It was already present before. And yeah, you could certainly build up quickly cheaper or more offensive capabilities like drones, maybe more quickly than other systems. But it would depend on what missions you wanted, as a country, what missions you wanted to be able to achieve. But yeah, no, totally, that is a very important issue. Yeah. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes left. I'll take this opportunity to ask another question since I have an opening. Christine, at the end of your presentation, you recounted a little bit of the history of U.S. perspectives on proliferation by friendly states, and that has not always been consistent over time. And it sounded to me like you might be taking the position that the U.S. and its allies should, or perhaps should in the future, consider that, again, as a possibility that's not entirely unwelcome. Is that the case? And if so, why?
Yes. Well, first of all, actually, comparing it to the European experience, actually, the in creating first the MLF that failed and then which eventually led to the Nuclear Planning Group as a sort of mechanism to try and reassure allies. The US tried to do that in Asia. It was something that would be called the Far East Asian Strategic Reserve. And Japan and other countries, this related to the CENTO alliance. Japan and other countries would be involved in maybe not nuclear decision making, but nuclear consultations with the United States to try and sort of reassure them, look, you guys, we're giving you some information about what might happen. But ultimately that failed. And I wonder so there are today two sort of avenues. There's a Japan-US dialogue and the South Korea-US dialogue, but there isn't, I'm not saying there should, I'm not sure yet what my thinking is on this, but I wonder to what extent that can become under what circumstances that could become a multilateral sort of thing. Because if different allies are going to be involved together in a contingency, it might make more sense for them to be aware of each other's responsibilities and what role they would play, what forces they would deploy. Not even before using nuclear weapons. But I don't see any good prospects for that happening. And again, the bigger question being some of the issues I brought up about geography and so forth. To what extent was extended deterrence a European concept? To what extent can it actually endure in the Asia Pacific, given all these issues? And for me, it makes strategic sense for the United States to allow, absent deploying U.S. nuclear forces on their territories, to allow Japan, South Korea, and Australia to acquire their own nuclear deterrent. They're stable democracies. We're not talking about Iran and Iraq here. These are countries that have stable democracies, strong civilian control of the military. They are U.S. allies. I don't see a huge issue with this.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, I think we are just about at time. So thank you all very much for coming out, and a great round of appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.